I moved into the old house on Oak Street because it was cheap. The house had a history, but I didn't care. I was just happy to have a place to call my own. The first few days were uneventful, just me unpacking and getting settled. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves. But then, strange things started happening. It was small at first, a light left on that I was sure I'd turned off. A door opened that I knew I had closed. I brushed it off, blaming it on the stress of moving. But then, one night, I heard footsteps. It was late and I was in bed, just about to fall asleep. At first, I thought it was just the house creaking, but the sound was too deliberate. Footsteps, slow and steady, moving through the hallway. My heart started pounding. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I lived alone. I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed, trying to be as quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, listening, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then the doorknob started to turn. I panicked and called out, "Who's there?" No answer, just the sound of the doorknob turning back and forth. I dialed 911, my hands shaking. As soon as the operator answered, the doorknob stopped moving. I told them what was happening and they dispatched a patrol car to my address. I waited in the corner of my room, the phone clutched in my hand, listening to the silence. When the police arrived, they found the front door wide open. They searched the house but didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. They told me it was probably just a prank, someone messing with the new person in the neighborhood. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The next few nights were quiet, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. I started keeping a kitchen knife by my bed just in case. Then, one night I came home late from work. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw someone standing in my front yard. A man just standing there staring at my house. I didn't recognize him, and something about the way he stood there, so still, sent a chill down my spine. I stayed in my car, watching him, trying to decide what to do. After what felt like forever, he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I waited a few minutes before getting out of the car, my eyes scanning the street. When I finally went inside, I locked all the doors and windows. That night, I barely slept, every creak of the house making my heart race. I started seeing the man more often, sometimes in my yard, sometimes across the street, always just standing there watching. I reported it to the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. They told me it was probably just a neighbor, maybe someone with mental health issues. But I knew it was more than that. One night I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my window. My bedroom is on the second floor, so it couldn't have been a prankster. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there frozen, listening to the knocks. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I didn't dare look out the window. The knocking continued for what felt like hours. But when I finally got the courage to check, there was no one there. That's when I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed my things and moved out the next day. I didn't tell anyone the real reason why I was leaving. I just said the commute to work was too long, that I needed to be closer to the city, but I knew the truth. There was something wrong with that house, with that neighborhood, something that no one else seemed to notice, or maybe they just didn't want to admit it. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Since I moved, I haven't seen him again, but I still think about him sometimes. I wonder if he's found someone else to watch, someone else to torment. All I know is, I'm never going back to Oak Street. Story 2. I never imagined working the night shift would lead me to question my own sanity. But that's exactly what happened at the old industrial plant on the outskirts of town. When I got the job as a night security guard, it seemed like a simple gig. All I had to do was monitor the surveillance cameras, patrol the grounds, and ensure everything was locked up tight. The plant had been partially shut down for years, with only a skeleton crew maintaining the place during the day. At night, I was completely alone. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., just before sunrise. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd make my rounds, check the cameras, and then settle in with a book or my phone to pass the time. The plant was huge, with long, dark corridors, vast, empty warehouses, and rows of machinery that hadn't been used in years. The place had a strange atmosphere, but I shrugged it off. Old buildings always felt a little eerie at night, especially when you were alone. But one night, about a week into the job, something changed. It was around 2 a.m. when I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. I was watching the surveillance feed, flipping through the different camera angles, when I saw movement in one of the back warehouses. It was just a flicker at the edge of the screen, so quick I almost missed it. I rewound the footage, squinting at the grainy image. Nothing. But I was sure I'd seen something, maybe a rat or a stray cat. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my gut. I decided to check it out, just to be sure. The warehouse in question was at the far end of the plant, a massive, cavernous space filled with rusting machinery and stacks of old crates. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the echo of my footsteps as I walked through the dimly lit aisles. I shone my flashlight into every corner, but there was nothing there. Just the same old abandoned equipment and empty space. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A faint scraping sound like metal against concrete. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from deeper in the warehouse, somewhere out of sight. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move forward, following the sound. It grew louder, more distinct as I approached the back of the warehouse, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stood there in the silence, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. No one. I checked every inch of that warehouse, but I couldn't find anything that could have made that noise. I was on edge the rest of the night, every little sound putting me on high alert. But nothing else happened. The next night I tried to put the incident out of my mind. But as the hours dragged on, I found myself staring at the monitors, waiting for something to happen. And then, just after 2 a.m., it did. A movement, this time on a different camera. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Something or someone was moving through the plant. My pulse quickened as I flipped through the camera feeds, trying to track the movement. But every time I thought I'd found something, it would disappear. Finally, I spotted it, a shadow, slipping between the machinery in one of the smaller workshops. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, determined to catch whoever was messing with me. As I entered the workshop, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable. Oil mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp. I swept the room with my flashlight, every muscle in my body tense. But again, there was nothing. The room was empty, just like the warehouse had been. But then, I saw it. A smear on the floor, barely visible in the dim light. I crouched down to get a closer look. It was oil, mixed with something dark and sticky. Blood. My stomach churned as I followed the trail, leading out of the workshop and down a narrow corridor. The walls seemed to close in around me as I walked, the air thick and heavy. The trail led to a door at the end of the corridor, one I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I could feel a cold draft seeping through the crack. I pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The room beyond was small, almost like a storage closet, but what I saw inside made my blood run cold. There, lying on the floor, was a man. No, a corpse. He was dressed in old oil-stained coveralls. Story 3. It was a Wednesday evening, and I had just returned home from a long day at work. My apartment was small but cozy, just enough space for me. I'd lived there for about a year without any issues, but that night, something felt different. As soon as I walked in, I noticed that the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I chalked it up to exhaustion and went about my usual routine. After a quick shower, I made myself a cup of coffee and settled onto the couch with my laptop. I was trying to unwind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started with small things, like the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as the evening wore on, the unease grew. At one point, I heard a faint noise coming from the other room, like a creak or a shuffle. I paused, listening intently, but everything was silent. I convinced myself it was just the building settling, as old buildings do. As the night progressed, I started noticing more peculiar things. I was sure I had left my phone on the kitchen counter, but when I went to grab it, it wasn't there. I found it later on the coffee table, but I couldn't remember putting it there. Then, the light started flickering, just for a moment, but enough to make me uneasy. I checked the light switch and the bulbs. Everything seemed fine. I was growing increasingly paranoid, questioning every little sound and movement. I decided to call it a night and head to bed, hoping sleep would put my mind at ease. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a soft thud coming from the living room. I froze, my heart racing. It was unmistakable, like something had been knocked over. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe something had fallen off a shelf. But I knew every inch of my apartment, and nothing was out of place before I went to bed. I got up, slowly and quietly, and crept toward the living room. As I approached, I saw a shadow flicker across the wall. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was in my apartment. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and prepared myself. I peeked around the corner into the living room, but it was empty. Everything was exactly where I had left it, except for one thing. The front door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. Someone had been there. Someone who knew how to get in without making a sound. I quickly checked the door, making sure it was secure this time, and then I did a thorough search of the apartment. Nothing was missing, but the sense of violation was overwhelming. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid that whoever had been there might come back. The next morning, I called the landlord and insisted that the locks be changed immediately. He was reluctant at first, but I wasn't taking no for an answer. The locksmith came that afternoon, and I watched as the old locks were replaced with new, more secure ones. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I started noticing little things again, items moved slightly out of place, doors left open that I knew I had closed. One evening, I decided to install a security camera in the living room just to give myself some peace of mind. I didn't really expect to catch anything, but I needed the reassurance. A few days later, I reviewed the footage out of curiosity. At first, everything seemed normal, just me going about my day. But then, in the middle of the night, the camera caught something that made my blood run cold. There was a man standing in the living room, staring directly into the camera. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. And then, after a few minutes, he turned and walked toward my bedroom. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized what this meant. Someone had been in my apartment, watching me as I slept. I called the police immediately, showing them the footage. They took it seriously, sending officers to check the building and the surrounding area, but they didn't find anything. That night, I stayed with a friend, too terrified to be alone in my apartment. The police promised to increase patrols in the area, but I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. The next day, I packed up my things and moved out. I never felt safe in that apartment again. To this day, I don't know who that man was or how he got in. But the thought that someone was watching me, that they could come back at any time, still haunts me. Now, I always make sure to lock my doors, double-check my windows, and keep a close eye on my surroundings, because you never know who might be watching.